we finished the explanation on the title of the sutra. The title of the sutra is called Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. And now the next word is the word sutra. So what's the meaning of the word sutra? In the Chinese language, is translated, the sound is translated into Silduro, that means sutra. Sutra has four meanings. That's a Sanskrit word. Sutra means a thread that strings, that ties the beads together. A sutra contains a philosophy that the Buddha, or the teaching that the Buddha has been talking about, and tied it together like in a string, like we have a rosary, that all the strings, all the beads were tied together. Second meaning is that which draws attention and produces influence. So it draws attention, focus. Third meaning, that which is unchangeable, truth. The truth about causality. So it does not matter what religion you believe in. Everything is on causality. There's no effect without a cause. And we all know that. So that truth itself is unchanging. So unchangeable truth. That's the third meaning. The fourth meaning, that which is true and should be followed by all. So once we learn the teaching, we focus our attention on the teaching, and we know this is an unchanging truth, then we follow it, we practice it. It's not enough just to talk about it and listen to it. It's extremely important that we should practice it, put it into practice. So that's the meaning of the word sutra. And I have been talking on the title of the sutra for 4 weeks, just on the title. And the reason is, it's very important that you know a general framework of the title. The meaning of prajna, the meaning of paramita, the meaning of sutra. Then once you know the title, then you know the general meaning of the whole sutra. It's easier to understand. I also follow the Chinese culture in talking about sutra. They usually spend a lot of time just on one word. It is written in some of the memoirs that there was a very high level, a very enlightened monk, and it's called Zhi, originator of the Tintai school. He taught on the word wonderful. We know that we have a sutra called Lotus Sutra, Puerto Rico, the Lotus Sutra. And when he starts to talk on the Lotus Sutra, because in front of Lotus Sutra, it is a wonderful Lotus Sutra. And he spent, that was in many years ago, 1,200 years ago, even before the Tang Dynasty. He spent 90 days to talk on that one word, wonderful, or wonder. He spent 90 days to talk about it. Because every word contains a lot of meaning. And it makes sense. And when I was at school, the professor always told me that if you are an average professor, you talk on a subject for the whole semester. In other words, here's a course, the semester is on this course, you use one semester to talk on that subject. If you are a full professor, or if you're an assistant professor, then you probably use the whole year to talk about the subject. Then you become an assistant professor. If you're a full professor, you use your whole life to talk on one subject. So that's the difference. What's the importance of prajna? Why is prajna important in the studies and practice of the Buddhist teaching? The Buddha spent the longest time in his teaching of prajna, 22 years. Out of his 49 years of lifetime, he spent 22 years to talk on the subject of prajna. Prajna is the blood and veins of the Buddhist various schools of teaching. So if you want to study the school, the Yogacara school, esoteric Buddhism or Amitabha's Pure Land or Madhyamaka or the Tiantai or Zen or whatever schools, you must know prajna. It is impossible for anybody to understand the Buddhist teaching without understanding prajna. It is certain that prajna is the Buddhist teaching as it agrees with the three Dharma seals. And we talk about three Dharma seals. Sometimes when someone talks on the subject of the Buddhist teaching, you don't know if the lecturer, the people who talk on it, you don't know whether it's following the Buddhist teaching or somebody else teaching. We usually use the three Dhamma seals to assess quickly whether it is within the boundary of the Buddhist teaching, but we already talked about the three Dhamma seals. Talking about 22 years, the Buddha taught his teaching for 49 years. Out of the 49 years, we classify the Buddhist teaching into 5 periods and 8 teachings. So the first period is the period of Avatamsaka Sutra. After the Buddha became enlightened, he spent the first 21 days. That's the first period on Avatamsaka Sutra. But that sutra was so profound that very few people understand in the audience. Almost none, or maybe a few understand what the Buddha was talking about. It was so profound. The profundity of it is so untouchable and ununderstandable by a lot of people. So the Buddha talked about something else, something simple. So that's the second period of the 4 Agama Sutras. That belongs to the Theravada school. And somebody called the Theravada school Hinayana. Some people call the Avatam Sutras period as the Mahayana. But that's really a classification by later generations, not by the Buddha. It does not matter what period. There's no such discrimination as this is a higher teaching, this is the lower teaching. It's just a classification of period. So the 4 Agaman Sutra is as profound, is as meaningful as the Avatamsaka Sutra. So the first period is 21 days. The second period, something easier to understand, the 4 Agaman Sutras pertaining to the Theravada school, and some people call it the Hinayana, the smaller wheel. But the word Hinayana is so discriminatory. We don't use the Maha and Hina. Maha is the big wheel and Hina is the smaller wheel. And what is being practiced now in Thailand and Burma is the smaller wheel. That's the reason why this is lower. We don't classify it that way. Don't misjudge. Don't misjudge Theravada as something lower than Mahayana. The discrimination only happens in your own mind, not with the meaning. Third period of Vaipulya Sutras for 8 years. So 12 years is Agaman Sutra, and the third period he spent 8 years to it. And the fourth period is Prajna Paramita, and he spent 22 years of the 49 years. The fifth period is the period of the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras. That was close to the time when Buddha entered into Nirvana. Before Buddha passed away, he talked about the Nirvana Sutras. So if you add all this together, if my mathematical calculation is right, it should be 49 years. 49 years altogether. So if we classify the Buddhist teaching as to the method of it, that's according to the time period in chronological order. But if you classify the Buddha's teaching into the method to it, so there's the southern school, there's the gradual school, and there's the esoteric school. Some people call it secrets, but it's esoteric. And the fourth is indeterminate. It's indeterminate because it depends on the audience. The Buddha teaches according to the audience. When he perceived that the audience had a higher level of understanding, he would teach something that's higher level. If it's average level, it's average level of teaching. So those are the 4 methods as to the teaching of it. The 4 teaching as to content. The first one is the Tripitakas, meant for Stravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. And some people call it Theravada school or the Hinayana school. The second is the general teaching, which is common to both the Mahayana and Hinayana. The third is distinct teaching, the Bodhisattvas, which is different, the way they classified it, which is different from Theravada. It's specific, it's distinct, different from. The fourth is the complete perfect teaching, the one vehicle. So there's no discrimination between Maha and Hinayana. It's all combined to one. That is the Lotus Sutra, what the Lotus teacher Sutra is talking about. All these classifications of time and content and method was not done by the Buddha. It's the later practitioners in the process of learning the Buddha's teaching try to analyze and break it down into parts so that they can understand it properly. It's not done by the Buddha. The Buddha didn't say, oh, this is my second school, this is my indeterminate school, and this is my first period, second period, third period. No, this is done by later generations. In the process of learning it, in the process of analyzing it, throughout the later 2,600 years, people have been classifying it. So don't look at this kind of classification as a discriminatory, with a discriminatory approach. Oh, this is better, this is the earlier period, the origin of the Buddha's teaching, and this is not the origin. No, you don't classify it that way. Okay. So that's the reason why we said Prajna is important, because to spend 22 years in it, it's difficult to translate sound. It's easier to translate the meaning. And translation is something that is so difficult to do. Why? Well, remember just about half an hour ago we were chanting Maha Karunika Chittadharani, a mantra, the mantra of compassion. And only the sound is translated, but not the meaning. Why? Because in the mantra, one word can contain a lot of meaning to it. If you arbitrarily stick a meaning to that word, to that Sanskrit word, you may distort the meaning. So in some mantras, when the Chinese translators translate mantra into the Chinese language, they maintain the sound and not translating the meaning, especially in mantra and dharma. So in the translation, there's 2 parts to it. Translation of word or word to word, and translation of just the sound. For example, Om Mani Padme Hum. That's the translation of sound. Mani is the most precious jewel on earth. Padme is lotus. Lotus symbolizes purity. When you want to open that treasure door and find a diamond inside, there's certain things that you have to do. For example, you've got to open your key, you've got to walk your way to that treasure hunt, treasure cave, and you've got to do a lot of work onto it. In Om Mani Padme Hum, if you want to find the diamond in you, review it, the brightness in you, you've got to be like a lotus, purifying yourself like a lotus. What do you purify? You purify your action, which is the body, your speech, and your mind. So there's a lot of purification practice you have to do. One of the practices is, of course, meditation. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to do in order to open that treasure door to find in yourself that diamond. So Om Mani Padme Hum. What is Hum? Hum is a Bodhi seed. Every time when you utter that sound, that seed is planted in you. That seed is planted in your consciousness. When it is planted in your consciousness, it is similar to keying in a computer memory. It's not erasable in this case. It's always planted in there. That seed, that latent energy. Seed is just a simile. It does not mean a seed of an apple tree, a pear tree, no. That seed is a latent energy in you. Every thought, every utterance is a latent energy in you that is planted in your consciousness. And when the time comes, it would move the shoot and then sprout into something, sprout into a tree, sprout, and then fruits will come. It's slowly growing and slowly growing. So it's very important that we plant seeds. There is no hope if there's no seed. Because if there is no seed, how can there be a tree? How can you have fruits? You're going to have a seed planted in order to get fruits. So every time when you utter Om Mani Padme Hum, don't belittle that utterance. It's a seed planted in you. The more you utter that mantra, the more seed is planted in you. It's an accumulation of the energy. And if you, unfortunately, for example, if you die in this life without realization, without enlightenment, that latent energy would grow with you into your next life. You take another body form, but that latent energy is always unchanging, it's always in there, waiting to sprout. Don't think that, oh, I'm just uttering a sound. That sound is a latent energy. Every thought is an energy. Every sound is an energy. So when you work into opening that treasure to get that diamond, you work not only with your sound, with the thought. You have to purify your thought. Every thought is important. If you know how to use that thought, if you can control that thought, if you can focus that thought, and you focus it in the right way, you become a saint. You're on your path to enlightenment. It's all about focusing. So when we talk about Prashna Paramita, in the Chinese translation, there is 8,600 volumes, approximately, of the translation of sutras into the Chinese language. It is so abundant. If we live up to 100 years, an average person, you may only have time, or may not even have time, to glance through all this literature once. Because so much, since thousands of years, or 1,800 years ago approximately, monks have been traveling from China to India and learned the language and brought back a lot of sutras and translated them. And the kings have been setting up translation academies to help them to translate. It's not just translated for one person. There's so many monks going over across the Himalayas and the Silk Road. Many monks went over to India. Some make it and some don't. Thousands didn't make it. They died on the Silk Road. Only about maybe a dozen, I don't know. Only a few make it to India. Fa Xian spent 5 years traveling to India. 5 years of traveling across the mountains and the desert, and 5 years. And Sun Zhang Dashi spent 3 years in the travel. Now we just fly over within 30 hours in a plane. This monk spent years in walking, in transportations, using all kinds of vehicles to travel to India to learn it. And a few make it. One exemplary monk was Sun Zhang in the Tang Dynasty. He made it to India, and he spent 17 years to study in India. He was probably the first foreign student who spent the most time in one country to learn it. Of course, before him, there's Fa Xian, another monk, Fa Xian, and he spent 5 years in traveling to India. When he started his journey in the capital of China, Chang'an, he was 65 years old. When he arrived in India, he's 70 years old. A no guy. You classified it as no guy. Imagine a man 65 years old and you're so determined that you want to learn the Buddhist teaching that you travel all the way on foot to India for 5 years. You walked 5 years to India, and you started to learn Sanskrit. And you were only 50 and you didn't want to learn any language. You're 65 and you started learning Sanskrit. You're only 35 and you thought that learning another language is hopeless. So, that's outside my topic. So, let's get back to this. So, internationally, the Chinese has the most abundant translation of the Buddhist teaching. Why? Not because of somebody say that's the superiority of the Chinese culture. No. It's those monks who spent all his time going into a foreign country and learn and brought them back and translated them. Individual efforts of all these monks. Literature of Prajnaparamita, very briefly, a lot of literature of Prajnaparamita. The short version of Prajnaparamita, the long version of Prajnaparamita. The short version, translated in English, is Perfection of Wisdom in 4,000 verses. You have English translation for that now. The original translation from Sanskrit into Chinese is by Kumarajiva. That was done in AD, 340 AD. And Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 verses by Lokazema, that is in 150 AD in China. That's the short version of Heart Sutra. The long version is Perfection of Wisdom in 18,000 verses by Dhammaraksa. Perfection of Wisdom of 25,000 verses by Kumarajiva. I just gave you a few examples of this. I just want to show you that there's a lot of sutras related to Prajnaparamita. And there's also the Perfection of Wisdom in 100,000 verses and Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra by Xuanzang. And some of these were not translated into Chinese. They were discovered by archaeologists about 150 years ago. Some by Max Muller discovered some of this sutra, original Sanskrit, and they translated. For example, I think the 100,000 verses the Chinese lost some of these sutras already during the war. During wars, the Chinese lost a lot of sutras, and they were discovered later in India or in Sri Lanka by archaeologists in Sanskrit scrolls. Okay, this is just an example. And some people like to know, are there any Western scholars in Prajnaparamita? A lot of them. Some quite famous ones are these ones that I quote. Edward Carnes, Max Muller, Eugene Brunner, Samuel Beale, Nancho Punya. So these are some of the scholars who specialize a lot of the time in the study of Prajna, and they translated some of the Prajna Sutras into English. Max Muller, Samuel Beale, and the Japanese Nancho Punya. All these very famous scholars in the study of Prajnaparamita. UPC used to have a few famous scholars, professors in the study of Prajnaparamita. Now UPC does not have a strong faculty in Buddhism anymore, probably because of the budget. Some of them went to McMaster universities, and some of them went abroad because they have different policy, shifting the emphasis on something else. I have been in Canada for 40 years. I know some of the professors at UBC, and some of the old ones died already. For example, the Japanese professor, I forgot his name. I was so close to him before I forgot his name even. I'm getting old. I can't remember names now. Professor Ida, yes, yeah. He left me some of his translation too. I forgot where I put them, now I'm going to take them out. And Professor Ida, Japanese guy. And there was some very famous Sanskrit professor too at UBC. And he retired 2 years ago. He was my teacher in Sanskrit. Azura Kujika, I still remember his name. Maybe he's still around. He's in Richmond, lives in Richmond. At one time I planned to organize a Sanskrit course because he retired and he promised me that he will come out and teach after retirement, but I didn't have time to organize it. Maybe I should. His wife is also an expert on Sanskrit. So there's a lot of studies in Prajnaparamita. The Buddhist teaching now has spread internationally. There was a monk who told me from Taiwan, and he said, right now he's using a marketing terminology. He said, right now the market for Chinese studies of Buddhism is getting stronger and stronger because they already have saturated the market in Pali, in Tibetan Buddhism, because these are easier to study because Tibetan and Pali and Sanskrit, they belong to the Latin language family. The English-speaking people can easily catch up with Pali and Sanskrit. The Chinese language is difficult to catch up. That's the reason why they spend all their time in Pali and in Sanskrit. Now, the market is saturated. They want to study Chinese so that they can learn more about Buddhism. That opens a road for you. Maybe you should study more into the Chinese language. 3 years of intensive study will pick up the Chinese language. It's not that difficult. Remember, Fa Xian picked up Sanskrit at the age of 70, and it became an expert in translation of the Sanskrit language.